Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I think we'll get started and hopefully some more people can start joining us. Just to start off by saying that we are recording this session. So of course, if you'd like to keep your camera off, that's absolutely fine. But I just needed to remember to say that. So a very, very warm welcome and thanks for joining us for this learning session today. A particular thank you, of course, to our speaker, Rebecca, who is joining us from California, where it is very, very early. So we're very appreciative of you giving your time to us today and the opportunity to learn from you. So Rebecca is a postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Berkeley, who are one of the Schools2030 Global Research Partners. Rebecca is part of the research team undertaking a project titled The Development of Picture Comprehension, Improving Learning Materials and Assessment Tools in Global Contexts. The team are examining whether picture comprehension is intuitive for all children, regardless of their early environment, and the research is taking place in Mombasa in Kenya. Rebecca is also involved in another study in rural Western Kenya, which is going to speak to us a bit about today as well. So given the use of pictures in learning materials and assessment tools, findings from this research will help determine whether these are effective or not for children from diverse backgrounds. Of course, for us at Schools 2030, where we have a work stream dedicated to assessment, this is a topic that is highly relevant to us, but also, of course, offers valuable insights more broadly for everyone interested in advancing quality, equitable education. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rebecca, who's going to give us a presentation. I believe there's going to be a chance to ask questions throughout, and then we'll also have time at the end for more questions. So feel free to write questions in the chat or save them up for when you can unmic and ask Rebecca directly. Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Ellen, and thank you everyone for coming to the session. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So as Ellen just mentioned, there are going to be a couple points where I'll pause for questions, but I'll, feel free. I think we're a pretty small group today, so feel free to just also unmute and ask questions or maybe type them in the chat. I can't see the chat while my screen is shared, but maybe Ellen, if you wouldn't mind like tossing out questions, feel free to just interrupt or raise your hand or just unmute yourself at any point. Happy to answer questions. So today I'm going to be talking about the development of picture comprehension and how we can use this to improve learning materials and assessment tools in global contexts. And I will say, I think we have one of our foundations here, but I will also say, this is an opportunity for information dissemination, but also as one of the I guess, inaugural Schools 2030 Research Partners. Our funding does run out next year, and we would really love to just continue this research program. So just to be very candid, that we are kind of sort of in search of more funding to continue this work with Schools 2030. And if you have any leads or call for proposals, we would love to know about that as well. So also before I start, just want to give a shout out to, our really interdisciplinary and international team. So we've been working with public health collaborators and psychologists in Kenya and the US, and their names are all listed below. Cool. So I just want to get started by asking everyone, and you don't actually have to answer, I'll do it, but what do these really popular early childhood assessments have in common? So here's one that people use all the time, both for kids and for adults, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is used to measure vocabulary size. Here's one that I actually recently used when I worked with economists in rural Western Kenya, the Bailey Scale of infant and toddler development, or just other really popular sort of standardized assessment materials that have been developed in Western contexts, but adapted to global contexts. And the answer is that all these assessments use pictures, right? To some degree. Some of them have items that use pictures. Some of them, like the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, literally have picture in their name because every single item in the assessment involves pictures. And pictures are widely used both in early childhood research and in classrooms, right? So I showed you some assessments, but it's also true that we also use pictures just to teach one another. So, you know, if you look at these like baby block books, which we show kids in the US from a really early age, titles like N is for narwhal. I'm sure most of us haven't actually seen a narwhal before, but we probably all have some idea of what a narwhal is, and that's probably from pictures and not from direct experience. So there's a lot of work in the US showing that by 2 years of age, toddlers have a really rich understanding of what pictures are, and that by 3 or 4 years of age, kids in like really urban Western areas like Toronto can actually learn new concepts from pictures. But there's a lack of evidence of how kids actually, how or when kids begin to understand pictures in more global contexts. And this begs the question of whether, these assessments and learning materials involving pictures might be ineffective or invalid, right? And there are costs to this if we want to conduct, high quality research in global context and ultimately implement policies and adapt curricula that way. So this is a problem for drawing conclusions in general, for example, in a lot of the intervention research we do. For example, like there are interventions in Kenya where what they're doing is actually promoting, parents and kids to read books together. And then, they test kids' vocabulary sizes using something like the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which I just showed you. And what they find is that kids' vocabulary sizes increase after they've looked at picture books with their parents, but it's actually unclear why. It's unclear if their vocabulary is actually increasing or just that the measurement, the method of assessment is getting better for them. So our research questions are in global context, how effective are learning materials involving pictures, and how valid are assessment tools involving pictures? And I'm going to show you two studies, the first one addressing this idea of learning, and the second one addressing this idea of assessment. And I just also want to say, throughout, we have tried our best to really follow best research practices for cross-cultural psychology. We have really close local collaborators who are co-authors on these papers. There's a lot of community involvement, both from like local nonprofit organizations, as well as schools and teachers and parents. And we really care about the timely dissemination of results, both to academic journals, but also the communities that are participating in this work. So in the first study, where we ask, how effective are picture learning materials for kids growing up in picture-sparse contexts? What we did is we went to rural Western Kenya. So for 2 months, I was based in Kisumu, which is the third largest city in Kenya after Nairobi and Mombasa. And our team stayed in Kisumu, but we would drive out, 1 to 2 hours to really rural areas to work with the toddlers in these really rural areas. And these are what the toddlers' environments looked like. So, you can kind of see like one sort of house in the foreground, and that would, house an entire family unit. So for example, mom, dad, and kids. You can kind of see another house in the background that might be, extended family like grandparents, uncles, and aunts. And so what you can see is these toddlers are growing up not with a lot of visual symbols around them, and also not a lot of stuff in general. or not a lot of like manufactured stuff the same way we have in Western contexts. This is a picture from a similar rural community. This is a school. So you can see, you know, again, just not a lot of visual representations. This isn't a place with a lot of posters or signs or billboards, but it's also not devoid entirely of visual representations, right? There are still, there are still signs, for example, you know, there's a school sort of billboard here with a little crest on it. So there are some kinds of pictures and visual representations, even in these really rural areas. And so, you know, we just wanted to ask if early variation in picture experience relates to kids' abilities to learn from pictures. So we tested 32 toddlers. These were really young 2-year-olds. Toddlers are notoriously difficult to work with. So we tested 5 additional toddlers who did not really want to participate. This was all done by a really wonderful local experimenter who was from the area, lived in one of these villages himself, and spoke the sort of first language of these kids, which is Luo. And we also gave each of the primary caregivers a questionnaire where we kind of asked about, you know, just a little bit more about the home environment. So we asked about the presence of picture books, you know, asking, are there picture books in the home, and looking at picture books. So have you looked at picture books with your kid in the past week? And note that these two variables are actually dissociable, right? Because some kids have picture books in the home but aren't looking at them. Some kids don't have picture books but can borrow them from, you know, friends or family that are nearby and look at them. We also got some sort of broad measure of child-directed speech. So do you talk to your child even when you're busy? We asked about the number of toys in the home and maternal education levels. And we found that there was significant variation in each of these questions. And so I'm going to show you the warm-up trials. I'm not going to go into too much detail about, you know, what these warm-up trials were trying to do, but basically we gave kids a picture of a flower and an actual cup, and we'd say, can you show me a flower, just to get them familiar with like pointing at stuff. And kids this age know the word for flower, and so they're really happy to just point at a flower. Similarly, we gave them a second warm-up trial where we gave them like a tennis ball and a picture of a chicken, and we'd say, can you show me a chicken, and just, you know, ask them to point at a chicken. And all these warm-up trials, toddlers performed extremely well. They were at like 90% accuracy, which is a remarkable performance for 2-year-olds. And so this kind of showed that, you know, they understand the instructions, they're happy to play this game. If you just give them 2 objects, including one that they know, they're happy to point at it. And now we get to the part where we're trying to teach them something new with pictures. So we show them a novel picture and try to pair it with a novel word. And we say, this is a dax. Can you touch the dax? And then we see if they learned the word dax and mapped it onto the new picture by getting them to select the dax over a distractor picture, like a picture of a banana. So kids had to do this 3 times. We'd say, can you show me the dax? And each time they'd have to select it over the banana. If they didn't get it 3 times in a row correctly, we would just kind of go back to the first trial and say, you know, hey, this is the dax, you know, can you touch the dax? And then try to redo the dax and banana trials. And then we gave them a slightly harder test question as well, where we gave the kid the picture of the dax, but also an array of 4 other pictures that should be pretty unfamiliar to them. And once again, we just say, can you show me the dax? And they'd have to select the dax out of, you know, all of these distractor pictures. And we thought this would be really easy. Actually, when we did this study, we weren't thinking about pictures at all. It started out as a study about word learning. And so we were really, really surprised, especially given their success on the warm-up trials, that only 17 out of 32 toddlers, so just a little over half the sample, actually learned the word dax and were able to consistently select the picture of the dax. 6 kids failed to select the dax 3 times in a row, and another 9 kids failed to select the dax from a, you know, wide array of pictures. And then the interesting thing is we went and thought, okay, well, is there any relationship between, you know, the sort of home environment and the picture experience of these kids, and whether or not they're learning the word. And what we find, so first we looked at presence of pictures, right? Just whether or not they had pictures, picture books in the home. So actually, exactly half of the kids, 16 of the caregivers said they had pictures in the home and 16 didn't. What we found was that there was no difference between those two groups. So whether or not you had picture books in your home didn't have any relation to how well the kid did on the task. However, what we then find is, we looked at the second picture experience variable, which was whether or not the primary caregiver had looked at pictures with their kid recently. And so again, exactly about like half the sample, so 17 caregivers said, yes, I've looked at picture books with my kid recently, and 15 said no. What we find is that the kids who had looked at picture books recently were significantly more likely to, learn a novel word from a novel picture than kids who hadn't looked at picture books recently. So basically, to kind of spell out this graph, toddlers who had looked at picture books recently with their caregiver, about 70% of them succeeded on this, picture learning task, whereas for toddlers who hadn't looked at picture books recently, only about 30% of them did. And we also found that there is no relation between between sort of task performance and other variables like maternal education, child-directed speech, or number of toys. So this suggests that it is actually something about variation in picture experience that's driving whether or not kids can effectively learn a word from a picture. Right, so I kind of like caution us from drawing too much from the study because it is only 32 toddlers, but this gives us some preliminary evidence that toddlers who looked at picture books might be better able to learn effectively from pictures. And so our next steps for this project is to collect more data from a larger sample of rural and urban kids in Western Kenya. And this work is actually currently under review as a registered report in a developmental psychology journal. This is a new format where we actually sort of propose the study we're going to do and sort of get it accepted in a journal before we actually go out and do it, which is kind of nice because it takes a lot of time and effort from both us and sort of the local community members to, participate in these studies. And so it's nice that we have a guarantee that, it'll get published if it's accepted. Maybe I'll pause there really quickly for questions. That seems like a natural place to pause. Any questions? I see there's one thing in the chat, but I can't tell if it's a question or not. Okay, I'll just keep going then. So the next thing we did, this was in collaboration with the Schools 2030 schools in Mombasa. So I went there with, one of our Nairobi collaborators in May of this year, and we worked with 10 schools in Mombasa. And basically here we were looking at assessments and asking if assessments involving pictures were valid in these sorts of non-Western global contexts. And so, yeah, that's Mombasa. It's actually quite an urban area. Initially, we wanted to go to Lamu, which is more rural, but there have been some sort of logistics issues with that. So we decided, as a first pass, let's just go to Mombasa and see what happens. So Mombasa is definitely just a much more urban environment than sort of the rural Western Kenya environment we were in. So while I was there, I took some photos of the schools. So almost all of the schools kind of had like murals on their walls. You can see this was actually from the most rural school we went to that was like an hour and a half out of town. And you can kind of still see that it's quite densely populated, right? We're kind of in the rural area, but you can kind of see the city in the background, and you can see even, in the foreground, there's lots of houses together. And so here we wanted to ask if, picture experience relates to the validity of assessments involving pictures. And so we pre-registered a sample of 192 kids, and they were all children in their first year of formal schooling. So in Kenya, that's called pre-primary 1 or PP1 at a Schools2030 Mombasa site. And within the sample, there was a lot of diversity, not only in picture experience, but also in like parental education levels and just, yeah, just, there were public schools, there were private schools. I felt like we were really getting a whole sample into Mombasa in some ways. And so I'll tell you about the two conditions in a second, but first I want to highlight, I'm going to call these kids preschoolers, but there's actually a fairly wide range here. The kids range from 2 to 7 years of age, but they were on average around 4.5 years old. And what we did is we gave them a PPVT style. So PPVT is a shorthand acronym for Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which I mentioned in the beginning. We gave them this, popular picture style vocabulary assessment in Swahili, which is these kids' native languages. And we did it either involving pictures, which is the standard way of doing it, or for half the kids in the other condition, we did it using objects. And we had a really talented research assistant here at Berkeley actually just draw out all of the objects so that they're as perceptually identical as possible. And then we had these really wonderful local research assistants who are from Mombasa and speak Swahili as their native language to conduct these experiments for us. And here's what it looked like. Oh yeah, so let me tell you, we gave each kid 12 trials and we gave them 3 kinds of words. And basically what we do is, we would show them 4 pictures or 4 objects and say, can you show me, or can you point at, a certain thing? So can you show me the toothbrush? And so we gave them nouns, which we thought would be pretty easy. Our really lovely Nairobi collaborator actually has a kid who just started PP2, and so he's like 5. And so we really based it off of which words he and his classmates might know. And so we had nouns, which were pretty easy for kids, toothbrush, hat, crayon, fork. We had numbers which are a little harder, they're typically kids start learning them around like 2 to 4 years of age, but it can be a really protracted learning process. So for these ones, we would say like, can you show me 1? Can you show me 2? Can you show me 3? Again, I'll show you what this looks like in a second. And then we had colors which were really difficult because for 2 reasons. One is that in Kenya, colors aren't actually taught to kids until they're in school, like formally. So, unlike US or Canadian culture where we have all these baby block books to teach our kids colors right away, this isn't the kind of like input or just content that Kenyan parents give to their kids in this culture. Secondly, not only do kids in Kenya not really learn color words until they enter school, but when they do, they actually learn these color words in English rather than Swahili. So we had to keep everything in Swahili just to like really standardize it. But we kind of knew going in that these Swahili color words were going to be hard. Our local research assistants, who are all really wonderful, smart, bright people, said that the color words were hard for them. So we imagine they're going to be pretty hard for these PP1 kids. And so here's an example of what it actually looks like. So here's a noun trial where we would say, can you show me a hat? Or in Swahili, that's nionyeshe kofia. And here we have the same thing, but with pictures, right? So you can see that the objects and pictures are really perceptually identical, but what's changed is just like the medium, if they're getting actual objects or if they're getting pictures. Here's a number example. So here we're saying, can you show me 3 or nionyeshe tatu? And here you can see both kids are kind of pointing at the array of 3. And then the last, we had, color. Here we had to ask kids, can you show me red, which was Nyoneshe Nyenkundu. And so kids would have to point to the bowl that was red. And so here are the results. Here are the 96 kids who participate in the object condition. Chance levels are 25%, because sometimes if kids don't know what's going on, they just guess, right? So they just point to 1 and they have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. So 1 in 4 is 25. And what we see is that in the object condition, kids are at 50%. So they're not perfect, but they're doing well above chance levels. This is a significant difference from chance. What we see from the 96 other kids who participated in the picture condition is that in the picture condition, these kids are also still above chance levels, but they're actually doing about 10% less accurately than the kids in the object condition. And so this shows that kids in their first year of formal schooling in Mombasa are performing better on a vocabulary assessment involving objects than the exact same assessment involving pictures. And what we also find, we can break this down by blocks and basically like the kind of word we were asking them for. So, this just helps us take a closer look at what's going on. What we see is that if you just look at the 4 nouns, so like toothbrush, hat, crayon, fork, in the object condition, kids are well above chance levels. These words are pretty easy for them. They're almost at 75%, right? Once again, we see they're doing significantly above chance on the picture condition. They're not just randomly guessing, but they're still not performing as accurately in the picture condition as in the object condition. You see the same pattern for numbers. So once again, kids can do both in both the object and picture condition, but they're doing better in the object condition than the picture condition. When we get to colors, which we knew were going to be pretty difficult for kids, you kind of see this effect or this object advantage disappear, right? When kids just don't know what the words are, this goes away. In both the object and picture condition, they're entirely at chance levels. So the difference between performance on picture and object assessments is really driven by the words that kids are familiar with, which in this case are the nouns and numbers. So in summary, preschoolers in Mombasa seem to perform better on an assessment involving objects than the same assessment involving pictures, suggesting that assessments involving pictures may underestimate kids' cognitive capacities, at least in some contexts. And one thing that we're trying to figure out now is actually how universal this difference in performance between picture and object assessments are. So we're actually collecting data from kids in Berkeley right now to see if kids in Berkeley show the same effect. The dominant narrative in the US has just been like, okay, we know that kids understand pictures, so we can test them using pictures. But it's actually possible that this object advantage, goes further into, Western contexts as well as, sort of more global ones. We also, in the future, pending the availability of funding, we would really love to also collect data from more rural areas. Hopefully, one day it'll also be possible for us to work with the schools in Lamu, and that's a much more rural area than Mombasa. It's actually, if you think about it, if the mechanism underlying this difference really is picture experience, it's really striking that kids in Mombasa, which is already pretty urban, are still showing this difference. And the difference might be even greater in more rural areas like Lamu. And so in summary, what we have we provide tentative evidence that, learning materials and assessment tools involving pictures might actually be inappropriate in some global contexts. And so this is really just preliminary steps, and we need to really learn more in order to be able to figure out, how to adapt these, learning materials and assessments to be more appropriate for kids around the world. It is also notable, though, that, you know, all this work is from Kenya, but our evidence does come from two sort of very different samples, both in terms of regions, languages spoken, and age ranges. So this seems to provide converging evidence that what's really going on is about picture experience. So this is where I really would love people's feedback on short-term next steps. Actually, maybe I should pause there again very quickly just to see if anyone had questions.
Oh, Rebecca, we did have one question in the chat, which was related to some of the practicalities of conducting this research. So a question from Sharifa wanting to know if you set a specific time for the child to respond or not when you were conducting the assessments. I think that was related to the first study, but you could speak to that in both.
Yeah. We did not, because actually we, most of the kids responded pretty willingly and pretty quickly. So none of them ever really timed out. I think the toddlers do need some reprompting, because toddlers, you know, we sometimes you literally have to like beg the toddlers to participate. But I think we didn't end up timing it because we typically don't do that with US kids, and we also didn't want to underestimate Kenyan kids' abilities by sort of, you know, timing them too rigidly. But I think everyone did the task in like a pretty appropriate amount of time. Yeah. And I see another hand raised. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Japara, we can see your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for the presentation. Hello, colleagues. I just wanted to know, were there, among the children who participated in the assessment, were there children who attend ECD centers and who do not attend ECD centers? Because just when you were showing, presenting the children who are good with numbers, when they were shown objects and just in pictures. So I think that if the children, if they attend ECD centers, maybe they are good at pictures rather than those children who do not attend, because in the family, mostly parents use objects rather than pictures, for learning. So what was the children's who attend ECD centers and do not attend, the difference?
Yeah, so I think this is, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But I think this was, I think they are currently basically in an ECD center, to my understanding. They're in pre-primary 1, which is basically preschool. And to my knowledge, none of these kids had ever attended any kind of like formal schooling before that. You know, some of these kids are literally 2 or 3 years of age. So, you know, one possibility is to go back and like ask the teachers, you know, about these kids' experiences, you know, prior to attending school. But we had a really specific time. You know, I wrote my PhD dissertation early and then just like flew to Mombasa right afterwards, because we really wanted to catch kids right at the start of their school year, for the reason that we kind of wanted to standardize, you know, to some extent possible, how much formal schooling they had had. And, you know, we really wanted as little as possible. Yeah. Is there another? Yeah, thank you for the question. Is there another chat question, or can I move on?
Can I ask my question, Ellen?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. Yes, sorry, I didn't see a hand up or anything, but if anyone has a question, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Agatha from Kenya.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I am interested in this subject because I'm also in the same area. So we are talking about children who also my target group. And one of the things that makes me want to understand more, one of the things I would like to understand more, maybe a bit of content could help, is the question of the pictures themselves. Now, the question would be, maybe if you can give us a little bit more content on how these pictures were selected. Was there some selection criteria? Because some of the pictures I saw there, for me, okay, I'm an adult, but I saw them for my first time. So you can imagine when you're talking about a child. So I'm thinking about pictures in context and wondering whether you could help us with a bit of selection criteria. What are they from the Kenyan curriculum, or how are they selected? Because when you talk about pictures, our curriculum development agency in Kenya here has clear criteria about the subject. So thank you. Over to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, we in this study, we were really focusing on like standardizing the picture to the object, right? And making sure that any differences we got between conditions wasn't because, you know, the hat in the object condition was just like more attractive. So what actually happened was I actually just, you know, Tabby and I acquired all of the objects, and then we had a research assistant draw all the pictures from them. So I can't say, you know, anything to standardization, you know, against the curriculum, but I know that at least we worked really hard to make sure that like all of these items should be really familiar to kids, you know, and I think that's really shown by the fact that like they are doing so well on the noun trials. You know, we had a lot of brainstorming sessions just asking, you know, what are 20 to 30 objects that kids know and can name, and trying to include those in our study. Even, you know, to the point where I think Tabby was buying like pencils for one of the trials, and she bought like a really pretty pink pencil, you know, and some of her co-workers and like parents in Nairobi were telling her like, oh no, you can't use those kinds of like really fancy pencils because kids in other areas of Kenya might not recognize them. And then we had to, you know, use very standard pencils. I see a lot of questions, which is really wonderful, but I also I have a big future direction section. So maybe we can take one more question, and then I can move to future directions.
Yeah, Rebecca, I see one question in the chat which is related to the results. So maybe you want to take that question, and then I see Alexandra has her hand up, and we can maybe take that to the post bit of this presentation. So the question is from Emily about, I think this is more related to the second study, because you mentioned about the relationship between parental education level and that didn't have an effect on the results. But Emily's question was, did you look at the relationship between parents' education level and the children's achievement levels?
Yeah, in the second study, we actually did. So we actually had parent questionnaires for these Mombasa kids as well. And our research assistants really painstakingly arrived at all the schools first thing in the morning to, you know, at like 6 or 7 a.m. to like catch all these parents while they were dropping off the kids. And sort of surprisingly, we didn't find any effect of like parent well, actually, so weirdly, we didn't find, you know, so basically all this to say, we also tried to conduct like individual difference level analyses with the Mombasa data, and they didn't really pan out. Weirdly enough, we actually found like a really small negative correlation with maternal education, such that moms who had higher like education levels actually had kids who performed slightly worse. I would take that with a grain of salt, because, you know, I would want to see that replicated in more data sets. That could just be like a weird fluke with this sample. We also saw, you know, kids got better with age, but kids who had more picture experience actually didn't do better on the picture assessment than kids with less picture experience on the sort of Mombasa assessment. And that's part of why we're kind of like questioning now, like whether, you know, this might actually be a universal phenomenon where like kids all over the world might do better on objects and pictures. And that's why we're trying to test kids at Berkeley. Yeah. And that actually leads really nicely into my future direction. So maybe I'll go there, but we can, when I open it back up, we can have Alexandra be the first question asker. Cool. Okay. So I'll try to get this through future directions really quickly so that we can have more time for discussion. But yeah, here are all the places I want to go and things I want to do, pending funding. Right now we have funding for one additional trip. And that'll be to wrap up and collect a larger sample to sort of validate and replicate our results from study one. But I think there's a lot of other questions to ask, right? Which are like, okay, so we found that, kids with more picture experience might be able to learn more effectively from pictures. We've also found that, object assessments might be better than picture assessments, but how generalizable are these findings, right? We've tested really, really young kids. We've tested toddlers who aren't even in school yet. And then we tested PP1 kids who are really only in their first couple weeks of formal schooling. So we want to see if these, findings also hold for older kids, maybe in elementary and middle school who have already been through a couple years of formal schooling. And we want to, look at other early childhood environments. So I mentioned Berkeley and LAMU, but also, other contexts globally. And I think that will help us, just more converging evidence will help us get confidence in our findings so that we have a solid body of research to build, policy off of as well. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is what exactly is picture experience, right? So, it could be presence of pictures, it could be specifically looking at pictures with an adult or a primary caregiver. So maybe in order to understand pictures, you really need, a competent adult sitting there and talking to you about what pictures are, or maybe just hanging out and watching TV by yourself is enough to learn what pictures are, right? But I think it's important to kind of get this mechanistic explanation so that we can better adapt our materials and figure out what kids are and aren't getting, and to help kids better understand pictures, right? I think there's a reason why we use a lot of pictures in our learning materials and assessment tools, which is that it's much easier to carry around a picture of a chicken and teach kids about that than it is to carry around an actual chicken. So in some ways, we might actually want to continue using pictures, but maybe we need to figure out, what kind of picture experience helps kids so that we can, design interventions or, design curricula to help kids get that information. And sort of, additional questions are how effective are learning materials involving pictures, in the classroom? We did this with toddlers and a really basic word learning task, but we'd love to do this with some actual work from the Kenyan curriculum. And also, insofar as kids also need to start drawing pictures and, drawing graphs and being able to visualize their ideas in school as well. We want to also look at when kids acquire the ability to produce pictures themselves. And also, kind of relating to a question we had earlier, does the kind and the content of the picture matter? And so I'll kind of break down kind of what I'm envisioning for these questions, right? So one thing is, does the kind of picture matter? So do kids have an easier time learning from this than they do from this? Or from this, right? We in all our studies use clip art because that's what's commonly used in a lot of storybooks and assessment tools. But it's possible that if we can use more hyper-realistic photographs, kids might have an easier time. And we've kind of actually, this is something we did where we actually looked really, really closely at the PP1 curriculum in Kenya. And to look at how effective learning materials involving pictures can be in the classroom. So we actually looked through the Kenyan curriculum a bunch, and we wanted to see if there were any sort of new concepts relevant to kids' school curriculums that we can teach using pictures or objects, and then see if kids learn more effectively from pictures or from objects. So we actually had a research assistant create this little storybook, and in the PP1 curriculum, kids actually have to learn about light and when it is and is not appropriate to use light. So we have this little storybook where we say, like, look, this is called a torch. Let's see what the torch can do. Wow, the torch can make light, and the light is so bright. You know, in the daytime, there's lots of light, so you don't need a torch to see things. When there is light, you can turn the torch off because you already have enough light to see. But the light from the torch can help you see into dark spaces like this jerry can. When it's dark, you can turn the torch on because you need more light to see. And so here we're kind of teaching kids what light is and when it is and isn't appropriate to use light. And then we can ask them test questions like, I'm going to look for toys in this box, which is dark. Should I use my torch? Why or why not? I think I left some toys outside where there's light. Should I use my torch? Why or why not? And we can see if these ideas even generalize to like new concepts, right? Like solar lamps. So if I want to read a book under my blanket, should I use my solar lamp? Or if I want to read a book with my blanket wrapped around me, should I use my solar lamp? And the idea here is that, you know, half the kids could do this with objects. I have that exact solar lamp and blanket and flashlight, and half the kids could do it with pictures. And we can see if kids are actually learning more effectively from object demonstrations than from storybooks. And also, while we were in Mombasa, we had a couple kids, about 20 kids, graciously agreed to help us out by producing some pictures as well. And here's what this looks like. So we had some kids draw cups, boats, chickens, fish. And, you know, another question we have, you know, in terms of both comprehension and production is why some kids are making drawings like this in PP1, and why some kids are making drawings like this, right? So again, going back to picture experience and mechanisms and thinking about how to get kids comfortable with drawing, so that one day they can, you know, make graphs or make their own art. Yeah, that's another question we have. And then, you know, in terms of really long-term next steps, I would love to get converging evidence from, you know, more countries and contexts to really show, you know, how to really pinpoint exactly how widespread this phenomenon is. And also, I think these questions aren't specific to pictures, right? I think there are lots of other kinds of visual representations that we use in the world and in our assessments and learning materials that we don't, you know, that kids in a lot of contexts around the world might not have a ton of familiarity with, right? So things like stuffed animals, puppets, maps, and even like graphs as kids get older, right? So how do kids in environments where there aren't a lot of visual representations understand something like a map of the world or start interpreting a bar graph? You know, is it intuitive for them, or might it be, you know, more difficult in some ways? Right. And so, you know, ultimately, this research is trying to address the question of how do we most effectively teach and appropriately assess diverse groups of children around the world. And currently, you know, we might be doing so somewhat ineffectively. We could be underestimating kids' abilities to some degree. And we really want to leverage these kids' existing strengths. Right, when we develop, you know, curriculums, interventions, and policies. Right, so sorry, tried to whiz through that. Thank you to my team. And yeah, I'll open it up for more questions now. So I think, is there something in the chat, or, oh, we wanted to go to Alexandra first, yeah.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you, and congratulations for the study, for the research, and thank you for sharing. Lots of questions that I might come with, but one thing that is important is to really understand how diverse the contexts are across Schools 2030 countries. But for sure, the need to understand the nature of the contact that children have with images might be interesting to a deeper discussion, because they might not have so many objects, but they can be exposed to TV or to cartoons in the mobile phone. So that kind of images and actions that are in a different dimension and in a different support is something that it might, when we are discussing learning environments, that might be interesting to understand how children are exposed to images, not only from objects, but also from pictures, photographs. So the reality of people and objects and everything, instead of representation of objects. That might be something. There are studies comparing that kind of exposure that is quite different, even with regards to cognitive functions that are required to that kind of issue. It would be at another moment for sure interesting to discuss this in what regards to competences at the level of literacy, how the language is mediating all these interactions to really understand how children.
Oh, I think you cut out, Alexandra. Oh no.
Correspondence term to term from a letter to an object and that kind of thing. So I think this might be interesting to understand, coming from your research, how language is supporting this understanding of children recognizing objects and actions and other interactions to enrich their vocabulary, for instance, but also in learning to read and write. So just to highlight some points that and some ideas that were coming to my mind when hearing your research and the future, where you are driving, coming from the two pilots that you already, and the results that you already have, and also from studies that we know regarding even the use of images in books and the use of the same images in educative resources using other supports, namely video and cartoons and other kind of learning materials that you know that are available. So yeah, sorry for this. This was a broader.
No, that's okay. I think it raised some really
probably a question, but some highlighting ideas that were coming when I was listening to you. And thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I think you raised some really good points about, we definitely are trying to figure out what kind of picture experience matters. And so like, I would actually really love to hear from teachers and parents about that, where they think about like what kinds of visual representations are kids getting the most contact with. I know like in Mombasa, some of these kids come from homes that have TVs and smartphones. Some of them don't, so there's actually really wide variation in the kind of picture experience that kids are getting there. And so it was actually kind of surprising that we didn't find any results of individual differences. But it's also possible, right? These kids are living in a pretty urban area. So it's actually striking that in some ways we found a difference at all. But we would love to go to other areas and kind of try to focus in more specifically on mechanisms like you've suggested, like, not just picture books, but cartoons and televisions and stuff. To your second point about word learning, learning. I think, that's exactly right. That's another thing where, like, once again, I'd love to hear from teachers and parents about how these things really work in tandem. My training is actually mostly as a psycholinguist, and my PhD dissertation is actually on language acquisition. So a lot of the questions that I ask about pictures are inspired by the kinds of questions that I ask about language, because they're both in some ways like referential symbolic systems. But I would love to know more just about how these things really interact in kids' actual environments. Yeah. So I think that's a great point. Are there more questions in the chat?
Rebecca, just to let you know that I already mentioned to Bro and one researcher in Portugal that has an extensive research regarding your study also. So it's related. If at some point you are interested, Rowan and myself, we can share.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, and I'm also happy to, I realize I didn't share my emails on this slide, but it's literally my name, Rebecca Zhu at berkeley.edu. So feel free to, this is an invitation for everyone in the session to just feel free to message me if you have any follow-up questions or comments. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Are there any final questions maybe? In the chat, there weren't any further questions. There was just a comment, I think. It was recommending you include manipulative plays in the assessment and the importance of play in assessments. So perhaps that's another line of inquiry you want to look into.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what manipulative play is, but I would love to hear more about it. I mean, another thing that kind of relates to play is this line of work on drawing as well, right? Where people have also speculated that in order to really understand, what pictures are, maybe you have to have some familiarity making pictures yourself, right? And maybe that goes into the play aspect as well, and learning what pictures are through playing and drawing and creating yourself. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we've stuck perfectly to time here. That was a really fascinating session. So thank you very much, Rebecca, once again for joining us and sharing what you've learned. And as Rebecca said, she's very happy for you to email her. When we follow up with the recording, we can also share your email so you can keep in touch and keep learning about the study. Oh, Rebecca's also posted it in the chat. So there you have it straight away. So thanks everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.